The crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the ballroom floor, each prism throwing diamonds of gold and silver across 300 faces turned toward a single point. But no one was watching the dancers anymore. No one was admiring the orchestra, or the imported champagne, or the $10,000 floral arrangements that lined the perimeter of the Grand Assembly Hall. They were watching him. General Dominic Blackwell stood at the exact center of the ballroom, his military dress uniform, midnight blue with gold braid and a chest full of medals earned in blood and strategy, immaculate under the chandelier light. His hand was extended toward Mrs. Vivienne Carlyle, palm up, fingers steady as steel. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either war or ruin. Mrs. Carlyle stood before him in a gown of crimson silk that clung to every curve, rubies dripping from her throat and wrists like drops of blood. Her dark auburn hair fell in calculated waves over one bare shoulder. She had the kind of beauty that made men stupid and women wary, all sharp edges and knowing smiles. She looked at his offered hand. Then she looked at his face. The general's expression gave nothing away. It never did. His steel-gray eyes were as cold and clear as winter ice, his jaw set in the same uncompromising line that had held through 3 wars and a dozen political battles. He was 48 years old, built like a man who still trained with his soldiers, and possessed the kind of refined, dangerous handsomeness that made people unconsciously step back when he entered a room. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Vivienne Carlyle placed her hand in his. Her crimson gown seemed to bleed against the pale marble as she stepped forward, and the whispers began, low, vicious, spreading through the crowd like poison through water. "Did you see, in front of everyone, his wife? Where is Lady Blackwell?" No one had seen the general dance in 5 years, not since his wedding. And now, in front of 300 of the city's most powerful families, senators and generals, industrialists and society matrons, the men who controlled the government and the women who controlled the men, he had chosen a widow. A beautiful, wealthy, unattached widow with a reputation for getting exactly what she wanted. The orchestra, startled from their confusion by a sharp gesture from the conductor, launched into a Viennese waltz. Mrs. Carlyle's smile was small and private and victorious as the general's hand settled at her waist, correct but unmistakably possessive. They began to move. The crowd watched in scandalized silence as the most powerful military commander in the nation swept Mrs. Vivienne Carlyle across the floor with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else. His posture was perfect. His steps were exact. His face showed absolutely nothing. But his choice had said everything. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, the 70-year-old doyenne of society who had presided over 3 decades of scandals with surgical precision, turned to the woman beside her. "Well," she said quietly, "Lady Blackwell will be destroyed by morning." The woman nodded, already composing the letter she would send to her sister in Boston. But then the grand doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The sound was slight, barely a whisper of brass hinges moving on well-oiled pins, but it cut through the music and the whispers like a cavalry saber through silk. Every head in the room turned as one, and there, framed in the doorway with the light from the entrance hall creating a halo around her silhouette, stood Lady Evelyn Blackwell, the general's wife. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, the bodice cut in the severe, elegant lines that were her signature. No ruffles, no excessive decoration, just perfect tailoring that turned her slender frame into something regal. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a style that emphasized the fine bones of her features and the long, graceful line of her neck. Around her throat, catching the light with cold fire, was the sapphire necklace the general had given her on their wedding day. She looked like a queen surveying a battlefield. She did not hurry. She did not falter. She did not show a single tremor of emotion on her pale, perfect face. She walked into that ballroom as though she owned every inch of it, and the crowd parted without a word, creating an aisle straight to the center of the floor, to her husband, to the woman in his arms. Evelyn's eyes, that unusual blue-green that shifted like the sea depending on her mood, never left Dominic's face. She did not look at Vivienne. She did not acknowledge the staring crowd, or the frozen orchestra, or the scandal that was even now crystallizing around all of them like ice. She walked with her chin high, and her hands relaxed at her sides, her steps measured and deliberate. On the dance floor, Mrs. Carlyle's victorious smile froze and then slowly crumbled. The general's face remained expressionless, a mask of control that had been forged in war and perfected through years of political warfare. But his hand, still resting at Vivian's waist, tightened for just a fraction of a second, his fingers pressing into the crimson silk hard enough to wrinkle it. Evelyn stopped 3 feet from them both, close enough that the entire room could see, far enough that she was not begging. The waltz stumbled to a halt, the musicians losing the thread of the music one by one, until only the cellist was left, and then he too fell silent. 300 people held their breath, and in a voice that carried across the entire hall, clear and cold and devastatingly perfectly calm, Lady Evelyn Blackwell said, "I see you've made your choice, General." 6 words. That was all it took. 6 words that would be repeated in every drawing room, every gentleman's club, every servants' hall in the city before the night was over. 6 words that turned humiliation into dignity, weakness into strength. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she turned, her midnight blue skirt swirling around her ankles, and walked back toward the doors with the same measured grace she had used to enter. The crowd parted again, silent, watching a woman walk to her own execution with her head high. The doors closed behind her with a soft, final sound. For 5 full seconds, no one moved. Then the whispers exploded like artillery fire. Mrs. Pemberton turned to her companion, her eyes bright with a gossip's gleeful horror. "My God," she breathed, "Lady Blackwell just committed social suicide." The companion nodded, already mentally composing 3 separate letters. On the dance floor, Vivian Carlyle stepped back from the general, her confidence rattled for the first time in years, and General Dominic Blackwell stood perfectly still, his face still showing nothing, while inside his chest, something that felt uncomfortably like his heart tried to claw its way out after his wife. The scandal, everyone agreed, would destroy Lady Evelyn Blackwell by morning, unless someone stopped it. The morning sun came through the tall windows of Evelyn's private sitting room in pale gold streams, catching the dust motes and turning them into something almost magical. It was the kind of light that belonged in paintings, soft and kind, the sort that made even ordinary moments feel significant. Evelyn sat at her writing desk with a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow, working through the morning's correspondence with her usual methodical efficiency. Invitations to respond to, charitable committee business to address, a letter to her father that she had been putting off for 3 days. She had always known what it meant to be the daughter of a disgraced man. Her father, Lord Edmund Hartwell, had once been one of the most respected diplomats in the nation. Brilliant, incorruptible. The man both parties trusted to negotiate the impossible. But a single misstep, a treaty negotiation with a foreign power that had gone catastrophically wrong, accusations of accepting bribes that he could never disprove, evidence that appeared and disappeared like smoke, had stripped him of everything. His title, his position, his access to the halls of power he had walked for 30 years, his reputation. Evelyn had been 19 when it happened, just presented at court, just beginning to navigate society as a young woman of good family and better prospects. She had watched it all crumble in a matter of weeks. The invitations had stopped first, then the calling cards, then the careful looks from other young women's mothers, the whispered conversations that fell silent when she approached. Her father had withdrawn to his small country estate, all that remained after his legal fees, and refused to defend himself beyond a single statement. "I did nothing wrong. The truth will reveal itself in time." It never had. She was 32 now, and she still felt the weight of that shame every time she entered a room, still saw the slight hesitation in other women's eyes, the calculation about whether associating with her was worth the risk. Her marriage to General Dominic Blackwell had been strategic from the beginning. For her, it meant protection. The general's name carried enough weight to shield her from the worst of society's cruelty, his reputation so unimpeachable that even being his wife granted her a measure of immunity. For him, it meant. She had never been entirely sure. He had courted her with the same cold efficiency he brought to military campaigns, deliberate, thorough, and utterly devoid of sentiment. 3 carefully chaperoned outings, 2 dinners with her father present, 1 formal proposal delivered in her father's study with the precision of a military report. "I require a wife," he had said, standing before her father's desk with his hands clasped behind his back. "Someone intelligent enough to manage my household, socially adept enough to navigate political events, and resilient enough to withstand scrutiny. You require protection and social rehabilitation. The arrangement would be mutually beneficial." Not a word about affection or attraction, or anything beyond strategic advantage. Her father had looked at her, his eyes asking a question. She had nodded. They had been married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony that was elegant but not grand, proper but not warm. And for 13 years, the arrangement had worked exactly as designed. Dominic had been kind in his way, respectful. He had given her a home in the city's most prestigious neighborhood, a household budget that never questioned her expenses, and the space to live her life without interference. He attended the necessary social events at her side, presented the proper image of a successful military marriage, and otherwise left her to her own devices. They had separate bedrooms, separate lives, really, that occasionally intersected for appearances. He had never raised his voice to her, never dismissed her opinions in the rare conversations they had, never treated her as anything less than an intelligent adult worthy of basic dignity. But he had never given her his heart. She had accepted that, built a life around it, found satisfaction in her charitable work, her reading, the salon she held twice monthly where she gathered interesting people for interesting conversations. It had been enough. Until 3 days ago, when Colonel James Whitmore had appeared at her morning salon uninvited, with a letter in his hand and calculation in his eyes. The salon had been winding down, the last guests preparing to leave, when Whitmore had arrived with the kind of presumption that made Evelyn's spine stiffen. "Colonel," she had said coolly, not rising from her chair, "I don't believe you were invited." "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Blackwell." His smile had been too wide, too familiar, the smile of a man who thought he held all the cards. "But I have information I thought you should know." Immediately. She had dismissed her remaining guests with apologetic grace, waiting until the door closed behind them before turning her full attention to Whitmore. He was a handsome man, in the way that weak men often were, all surface charm and no substance, the kind of officer who had advanced through political connections rather than actual competence. He had been angling for a promotion to general for 3 years, blocked each time by men who actually understood military strategy, men like her husband. "This had better be important, Colonel. I have appointments." "Oh, it is." He had crossed to her sitting area without invitation, taking the chair opposite hers as though they were intimates. "It concerns your husband and Mrs. Vivian Carlyle." Evelyn had kept her face perfectly composed, even as something cold slithered down her spine. The general's military affairs often require him to meet with various members of society. Mrs. Carlyle is a senator's widow with significant political connections. I'm sure any meetings between them are perfectly proper. Of course, Whitmore's eyes had gleamed with malicious satisfaction. Though these meetings have been quite extensive, dinners at Delmonico's, private carriage rides through the park, late evenings at her estate that extend well past midnight. He had placed a letter on the small table between them, handling it like a weapon. "I only thought you should be prepared, Lady Blackwell. The winter ball is in 3 days. If the general chooses to acknowledge Mrs. Carlyle publicly—" He had trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. A wife could survive many things in their world. A husband's discreet affairs, handled with proper discretion, were often overlooked. But public humiliation at the hands of her own husband, public acknowledgement of a mistress in front of society's entire elite, that was social death. That was the end of everything she had carefully built over 13 years. Evelyn had thanked him with icy courtesy and shown him out, her hand steady on the door handle, her face revealing nothing. Then she had returned to her sitting room, closed the door, and read the letter. It was from an anonymous source, of course it was, but the details were devastatingly specific. Dates, times, locations. The general had indeed been meeting with Mrs. Carlyle, repeatedly. The letter even included descriptions of what they had worn, what they had ordered at dinner, how long his carriage had remained at her estate. Someone had been following her husband. Someone had been documenting his every move, and someone had given that documentation to Whitmore, who had delivered it to her like a gift-wrapped grenade. Evelyn had felt something crack inside her chest as she read. Not heartbreak. Not yet. She had built too many walls around her heart for it to break that easily. But fury. Cold, clear, focused fury. She had given this man 13 years of loyalty. She had stood beside him through political battles and military campaigns, and the endless, exhausting scrutiny of a society that had never forgiven her father's sins. She had managed his household, hosted his political dinners, smiled through 1,000 tedious events at his side. She had been the perfect strategic wife, and he had repaid her with this. She made her decision in that moment, sitting in her sun-filled room with the evidence of her husband's betrayal in her hands. She would go to the winter ball. She would see for herself. And if Dominic Blackwell chose to humiliate her in front of the entire city, she would make absolutely certain he regretted it for the rest of his life. Dominic Blackwell had built his entire career on patience. Wars, real wars, were not won by impulsive men who charged into battle fueled by emotion and adrenaline. They were won by strategists who could see 3 moves ahead, who could sacrifice a pawn to protect a king, who could endure discomfort and criticism and the gnawing uncertainty of the long game in service of a larger victory. His office in the military headquarters downtown was a testament to that philosophy. Organized, efficient, every document filed with precision, every decision tree mapped out on the large chalkboard that dominated one wall. This particular war, the one that mattered more than any battlefield campaign, had been brewing for 18 months. It had started with the death of Senator Harrison Carlyle, Vivian's husband, in what had been officially ruled a tragic hunting accident. Dominic had not believed it for a single moment. Harrison Carlyle had been many things: a competent senator, a skilled negotiator, a man of principle when it came to certain issues. He had also been one of the few senators who had openly and vocally opposed Ambassador Richard Thornwell's military appropriations bill, a massive piece of legislation that would have funneled millions of dollars into military contracts. Contracts with companies that Dominic had discovered Thornwell secretly controlled through a maze of shell corporations and proxies. When Carlyle died, shot by his own rifle in what was claimed to be an accident while hunting alone on his estate, the opposition to Thornwell's bill had collapsed like a house of cards. The bill had passed 3 weeks later, and Dominic, who had spent 20 years learning to spot patterns in chaos, had begun to dig. What he found was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, a web of corruption and murder that made his blood run cold. Thornwell had orchestrated Carlyle's death. Dominic was certain of it, but certainty wasn't proof, and without proof, Thornwell was untouchable, too connected, too powerful, too careful. The key was Colonel James Whitmore. Whitmore was Thornwell's creature, a mediocre officer who had been promoted beyond his competence through political connections. He was also, Dominic had discovered, the man who had actually arranged Carlyle's murder, hiring the assassin, staging the scene, paying off the investigator who had ruled it an accident. But proving that required evidence that Whitmore had been careful to destroy, except for one possibility. Harrison Carlyle had been a meticulous man. He had kept detailed records of everything: financial transactions, political meetings, private conversations. If those records still existed, if Vivienne had access to them, if she even knew they existed, Dominic could bring down Thornwell and Whitmore both. He could expose the entire conspiracy and prevent them from doing it again. But Vivienne was no fool. Beautiful, yes, charming, certainly, but also intelligent and wary and acutely aware that she was sitting on information that could get her killed. She would not give it up easily. She would not give it up at all unless she had something to gain. So Dominic had done what any good strategist would do when the direct approach was impossible. He had made himself bait. For 6 months, he had courted Vivian Carlyle publicly. Dinners at the city's finest restaurants, carriage rides through the park during the fashionable hour when everyone would see, private meetings at her estate that he made sure lasted long enough to fuel speculation. He had let the rumors spread like wildfire. He had let Whitmore and Thornwell see exactly what they expected to see. A powerful man compromised by a beautiful woman, distracted from his usual vigilance, vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation. He had watched them grow confident, and he had waited for Vivian to make her move. 3 days ago, she had finally sent him a note, delivered by her personal maid with instructions that it was for his eyes only. "General Blackwell, I have something you want. Harrison's private files, all of them. But I require something in return. Come to the winter ball. Dance with me. Show them all that I've won you. Let Thornwell and Whitmore see that the great General Blackwell can be claimed. Then we'll discuss terms for the files. V." It was a power play, pure and simple. Vivian wanted to be seen as the woman who had brought the untouchable General Blackwell to heel, who had made him forget his duty and his dignity for her. It would give her social power, protection, a position in society that even a senator's widow couldn't claim without that kind of validation. Dominic had read the note 3 times, analyzing every word, every implication. Then he had sent back a single word, agreed, because once she gave him the evidence, and she would, once she felt secure in her victory, he would use it to destroy Thornwell and Whitmore completely. The conspiracy would be exposed, justice would be served, and Vivian would get the social standing she craved, earned by bringing down the men who had killed her husband. It was a perfect strategy, except for one catastrophic oversight. He had not told Evelyn. He stood in his study the night before the ball, staring at Vivian's note, and felt the weight of that mistake settle over him like a burial shroud. He had not told Evelyn because involving her would put her in danger. Thornwell and Whitmore would not hesitate to use her against him if they suspected she knew anything. He had not told her because he had spent 13 years carefully protecting her from the uglier parts of his work, keeping her separate from the violence and manipulation that defined his professional life. He had not told her because he was a damned fool who had convinced himself that strategy mattered more than trust. And now, as he stood in the silence of his study with the fire crackling in the hearth and the clock ticking toward midnight, he realized with cold, creeping certainty that he had made the worst mistake of his career. Evelyn would be at the ball. Of course she would. She never missed important social events. It was part of her role, part of the arrangement they had made 13 years ago. She would see him dance with Vivian. She would see him make a public statement with that dance, claiming another woman in front of everyone who mattered, and she would believe the worst. He could tell her the truth now. Go to her room, explain the strategy, ask her to trust him through one more night of performance. But the risk was too great. If Evelyn's reaction tomorrow night was anything less than genuinely hurt, if there was even a hint that she knew what he was doing, Vivian would sense the trap. The woman hadn't survived her husband's murder and the aftermath by being careless. Dominic set the note down and poured himself a whiskey he didn't want. He had sacrificed many things for his work over the years: comfort, safety, sleep, the respect of men who thought military strategy should involve more glory and less patience. Tomorrow night, he would sacrifice his wife's trust. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself she would understand eventually when he could explain. He told himself it was the only way to bring down Thornwell without putting her in danger, but deep in the part of him that he had spent 20 years learning to ignore, the part that had noticed how the light caught in her hair during their rare dinners together, how her eyes sparked when she was debating a point she cared about, how she had quietly, competently made their house into something that almost felt like a home. He knew he was about to hurt the one person who had never deserved it. And worse, he knew he was doing it deliberately. For strategy, for the mission, for everything except the woman who had stood beside him with loyalty and grace for 13 years. Dominic finished his whiskey and went to bed. He did not sleep. Evelyn arrived at the Grand Assembly Hall precisely 1 hour after the ball had officially begun, late enough to make an entrance, early enough that the dancing would be in full swing. She had dressed with the kind of care usually reserved for battle, because that's exactly what this was. The midnight blue silk gown had been commissioned specifically for this event. cut in lines that were both severe and beautiful, elegant without being showy. The bodice fit like a second skin. The skirt fell in graceful folds that whispered against the floor when she moved. The color made her skin look like porcelain and turned her eyes into something electric. Her hair had taken her maid 2 hours to arrange, pulled back from her face in a style that emphasized her bone structure, then twisted into an elaborate knot at the base of her neck, with a few strategic tendrils left loose to soften the effect. Around her throat, the sapphire necklace Dominic had given her on their wedding day caught the light with cold blue fire. She wanted him to see exactly what he was throwing away. The grand entrance to the assembly hall was all white marble and soaring columns designed to make every arrival feel significant. Evelyn climbed the steps with her head high and her expression serene, ignoring the way conversations faltered as people recognized her. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton intercepted her at the top of the stairs, appearing in a rustle of purple silk and barely concealed glee. "Lady Blackwell," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How brave of you to come." Evelyn stopped, met the old woman's eyes with ice. "Why would I not attend, Mrs. Pemberton? It's the social event of the season." "My dear." Mrs. Pemberton leaned in, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that carried to at least a dozen nearby guests. "Everyone knows about the General and Mrs. Carlyle. If you're here to make a scene—" "I am here," Evelyn said clearly, her voice pitched to carry without seeming to project, "because this is my city and I will not be driven from it by gossip and speculation. Now, if you'll excuse me." She walked past without waiting for a response, leaving Mrs. Pemberton sputtering behind her. The ballroom was a blaze of light and color and sound. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, their reflected light dancing across the polished marble floor. 500 guests, she had heard the number was even larger than expected, filled the enormous space in a sea of silk and jewels and formal military dress. The orchestra played from their elevated platform at one end, a Strauss waltz that made the dancers look like they were floating. And there, standing near the center of the room in conversation with 2 other officers, was Dominic. He wore his full military dress uniform, midnight blue coat with gold braid and buttons polished to a mirror shine, white gloves, a chest full of medals that represented 3 wars and countless smaller campaigns. His posture was parade ground perfect, his dark hair groomed with precision, his expression the controlled neutrality he wore like armor. He looked, as always, untouchable. Their eyes met across the crowd, 50 feet and 500 people between them, and for a moment something flickered in his steel-grey gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or something Evelyn couldn't quite name. Then Mrs. Vivian Carlyle appeared at his side, materializing in her crimson gown like a drop of blood against his formal blue, and the moment shattered. Evelyn watched, her heart suddenly beating too hard in her chest, as Vivienne leaned in to whisper something in Dominic's ear. Watched as he inclined his head slightly to hear her, his expression never changing. Watched as the orchestra finished the current waltz and began transitioning to the next piece, and watched with a horror she refused to show on her face, as Dominic turned to Vivienne and extended his hand in an unmistakable invitation to dance. The conversations around them stopped like someone had cut the strings. Every eye in the ballroom turned to watch. Vivienne took his hand with a smile of pure triumph. They stepped onto the floor. Evelyn felt the room tilt, her vision narrowing to a single point of focus, her husband's hand at another woman's waist, his body moving in perfect time with hers, his face showing absolutely nothing, while 300 people watched him make a public claim. She had known this was coming, had prepared for it, but knowing and seeing were 2 entirely different things. Beside her, someone whispered, "Oh my God, is that... his wife is right there. I can't believe he would..." The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, gaining speed and volume until the entire room seemed to buzz with scandal. Mrs. Pemberton materialized at Evelyn's elbow, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, my dear Lady Blackwell, how absolutely mortifying for you. If you'd like to leave quietly, I'm sure no one would blame..." Evelyn did not respond. She couldn't, because she had just noticed something that made her entire understanding of the situation shift like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. Dominic was not looking at Vivienne. Oh. His face was angled toward her, his expression polite and attentive. But his eyes were scanning the room with the same cold, calculating focus he used when reviewing battlefield maps. He was looking for someone, and then Evelyn saw him. Colonel James Whitmore, standing near the far wall beside a marble pillar, watching Dominic with barely concealed satisfaction. He wore his dress uniform, his chest noticeably lacking the number of medals Dominic wore, his posture suggesting a man who thought he'd already won. And beside him, half hidden in the shadows, was Ambassador Richard Thornwell. Evelyn knew Thornwell by reputation, a political operator with his fingers in a dozen pies, a man who collected power like other men collected art. He was watching Dominic dance with Vivian with the expression of a chess player who'd just seen his opponent make the expected mistake. The pieces clicked together in Evelyn's mind with sudden, crystalline clarity. This was not an affair. This was something else entirely, something strategic, something dangerous. And her husband had deliberately kept her in the dark about it. The fury that had been simmering for 3 days suddenly flared white-hot. Evelyn made her decision in a single heartbeat. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not flee. She would not collapse into tears or hysterics or any of the other things a humiliated wife was expected to do. She would do what she had always done when society tried to break her. She would take control of the narrative. Evelyn began to walk, not toward the doors, not away from the scandal, toward it. Her steps were measured, deliberate, each one carrying her closer to the center of the ballroom where her husband danced with another woman. The crowd parted before her automatically, people scrambling to get out of her way as though she were a force of nature. The music continued, but Evelyn could see the musicians starting to lose their place, distracted by the drama unfolding before them. She kept her chin high, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression serene, like a queen walking to her coronation or her execution. When she reached the edge of the dance floor, she stopped. Not beside them, not interrupting, just present. 3 feet from her husband and his dancing partner, close enough that the entire room could see, far enough that she maintained her dignity. The waltz faltered, musicians losing the thread one by one, until only the cellist continued for a few stubborn measures before he too fell silent. 300 people held their breath. Vivian's confident smile had frozen on her face, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Dominic with something that looked almost like uncertainty. Dominic's hand at Vivian's waist tightened for just a fraction of a second, the only sign that he had registered Evelyn's presence. His face, when he finally met her eyes, was still perfectly controlled. But Evelyn knew him well enough after 13 years to see the minute tension in his jaw, the slight widening of his pupils, the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly toward her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and let him see everything in her eyes. The betrayal, the fury, the hurt she had not wanted to feel, and underneath all of that, a question. Was this worth it? Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with perfect, devastating clarity. "I see you've made your choice, General." 6 words. That was all it took. 6 words that would echo through every social circle in the city. 6 words that transformed her from victim to something else entirely. She held his gaze for one more second, long enough to see something crack in his controlled expression, some flash of emotion too quick to name, then turned with liquid grace and walked toward the doors. The crowd parted again, creating a clear path to her exit. Every step was measured, every movement was deliberate. She did not run, she did not cry. She simply left, her midnight blue gown swirling around her ankles, the sapphires at her throat catching the light one last time. The doors closed behind her with a soft final sound that seemed louder than a gunshot in the silent ballroom. For 5 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the whispers exploded like artillery fire, hundreds of conversations starting simultaneously, the scandal spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Mrs. Pemberton turned to her nearest companion, her eyes bright with the kind of gleeful horror that fed society's gossip machine. "My God," she breathed. "Lady Blackwell just committed social suicide. She won't be received anywhere after this." On the dance floor, Vivienne stepped back from the general. Her triumph rattled for the first time in years. "General, But Dominic wasn't listening. He was staring at the doors where his wife had disappeared, his controlled expression finally cracking to show something raw and painful underneath. He had just sacrificed his marriage for strategy, and he had no idea if it had been worth it. Evelyn did not go home. She could not face their house, with its perfect rooms and careful arrangements and all the evidence of 13 years spent building a life that had just been publicly dismantled. Instead, she directed her driver to take her to her father's estate on the outskirts of the city, where Lord Edmund Hartwell lived in quiet disgrace. The house was small by aristocratic standards, a manor that had seen better days with peeling paint, and a garden that had gone slightly wild from lack of proper staff. But it was still home in a way the grand house she shared with Dominic had never quite managed to be. Her father met her at the door before she could knock, his lined face creased with worry. He wore a simple dressing gown over his nightshirt, his grey hair dishevelled as though he'd been running his hands through it. "Evelyn." His voice was rough with concern. "What's happened?" She told him everything. The letter from Whitmore, the rumours about Vivian, the ball, the dance, her public exit that had just destroyed whatever social standing she had managed to salvage over 13 years. When she finished, her father was silent for a long moment, studying her face with the sharp intelligence that had made him such an effective diplomat before his fall. Then he said something unexpected. "That doesn't sound like Blackwell." Evelyn looked up sharply from the tea he had pressed into her hands. "What?" "Dominic Blackwell is many things," her father said slowly, moving to sit in the chair across from her. "Cold, strategic, ruthless when necessary. I've watched him operate in political circles for years now. The man doesn't make a move without 3 contingency plans." He leaned forward, his eyes intent. "But he is not cruel, Evelyn. And what you've described, publicly humiliating you in front of the entire city's elite, that is cruelty." "Then what is it?" Evelyn's voice came out harder than she intended. Her father was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in the gesture she remembered from her childhood, when he was working through a particularly complex problem. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should find out what your husband is actually doing before you decide how to respond. You think this is strategy?" It wasn't a question. "I think Dominic Blackwell doesn't do anything without a reason, and I think that reason is rarely the obvious one." Her father's expression softened. "I also think that in 13 years of marriage, he has never once been unkind to you. Distant, yes, controlled, certainly, but never cruel." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to cling to her fury because it was cleaner than the alternative, that maybe there was something else happening, something she didn't understand. But her father had been a diplomat for 30 years before his fall. He knew how to read power plays and hidden agendas. And despite everything, despite the humiliation and the hurt, a small part of her wanted him to be right. She stayed at her father's estate that night, in her old room that still held remnants of the girl she'd been before her world had collapsed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. And most of all, she replayed that final moment when Dominic's eyes had met hers across the dance floor, the way something had cracked in his expression, the way he had moved toward her just slightly before catching himself, the way he had looked like a man who had just made a terrible mistake. Dominic left the ball exactly 30 minutes after Evelyn, long enough to complete the dance with Vivian, to let the gossip reach its peak. Long enough for Vivian to whisper in his ear, her voice satisfied and certain, "Meet me in the East Garden in half an hour. I have the documents ready. You've certainly earned them tonight." Long enough to see Whitmore and Thornwell exchange satisfied glances across the ballroom, their expressions confirming that they had seen exactly what they expected to see. A man compromised, distracted, vulnerable. Then he had excused himself with military precision, his face showing none of the chaos raging beneath his controlled surface, and disappeared into the night. The east garden of the assembly hall was designed for romantic assignations, winding paths through carefully sculpted hedges, marble benches hidden in alcoves, the kind of calculated privacy that allowed society's elite to conduct their affairs with plausible deniability. Vivian was waiting for him beneath a stone archway covered in ivy, the moonlight turning her crimson gown into something dark and blood-like. She held a leather portfolio. General Blackwell. Her smile was different now, less performative, almost sad. You certainly know how to put on a show. The documents, Dominic said quietly. She handed him the portfolio without ceremony. He opened it there in the moonlight, angling the papers to catch the light from the distant ballroom windows. Inside, financial statements showing payments from Thornwell's shell companies to Whitmore. Coded correspondence between Thornwell and the man who had killed Harrison. And most damning of all, a signed confession Harrison had written before his death, detailing Thornwell's conspiracy and hidden in his personal effects. It was everything Dominic needed to bring down Thornwell and Whitmore both. It was also, in that moment, completely irrelevant, because all he could see was Evelyn's face as she had looked at him on that dance floor. The hurt in her eyes that she had tried so hard to hide. The way she had held her chin high even as he destroyed her. "Why?" he asked Vivian, his voice rough. She blinked, surprised by the question. "Why what?" "Why give this to me? You could have used it yourself, blackmailed Thornwell, secured your position in society without needing—" He gestured vaguely at the portfolio, unable to finish the sentence. "Without needing to publicly claim me as your prize." Vivian's expression shifted, the practiced seductress falling away to reveal something more genuine underneath. "Because Harrison was a good man," she said quietly, "and they murdered him. I've spent 18 months trapped in this widow's role, smiling at his killers, playing their games because I was too afraid to move against them alone." She looked at the portfolio in his hands. "You were my best chance, my only chance. Really, a man powerful enough to destroy Thornwell, motivated enough to see it through." She smiled faintly. "I knew you were using me. I'm not a fool, General." "Then why agree to this?" Dominic gestured at the ballroom behind them, at the scandal still echoing through its halls. "Because I needed someone powerful enough to take Thornwell down, and you needed bait." She tilted her head, studying him with sharp intelligence. "We used each other. I made my peace with that the day I agreed to your first dinner invitation." She paused, then added softly, "I also knew you'd never actually betray your wife. You're too principled for that. Too controlled." Another pause. "The way you looked at her tonight, just before she left, that was real. Everything else was performance." Dominic closed the portfolio with careful precision, his mind already racing through the next steps of the strategy. Thornwell's arrest, Whitmore's court-martial, the evidence chain that would bring them both down. But underneath all of that, growing louder with every second, was a different voice. "What have you done?" "Thank you," he said to Vivian. She nodded, her own smile tinged with something like sympathy. "Go fix your marriage, General. You just destroyed your wife's social standing to catch a murderer. The least you can do is explain why before she files for legal separation." Dominic stared at her. "How did you—" "Because that's exactly what I would do in her position." Vivian's voice was dry. "You have perhaps 12 hours before Lady Blackwell makes this permanent. I suggest you use them wisely." She walked past him back toward the ballroom, leaving him alone in the moonlit garden with the evidence of his victory and the weight of his mistake. Dominic looked at the portfolio in his hands. Then he looked toward the city, where Evelyn was somewhere in the night, believing the worst of him. He made his decision. The evidence could wait until morning. His wife could not. Dominic arrived at Lord Hartwell's estate 2 hours before dawn, the sky still dark, but beginning to show the first hints of grey at the eastern horizon. The old man answered the door himself, wearing a dressing gown and holding a lamp, his expression somewhere between concerned and furious. "Blackwell." His voice was cold. "You have some nerve showing up here. I know." Dominic met his father-in-law's eyes steadily. "Is she here?" "Where else would she go?" Lord Hartwell stepped back, but his posture was rigid with barely controlled anger. "The entire city just watched you humiliate my daughter. You're lucky I'm answering the door instead of shooting you from the window. I deserve that. You deserve a hell of a lot more than that." The old man's eyes flashed. "Evelyn has spent 13 years being the perfect wife to you, managing your household, standing beside you through every political battle, enduring the scrutiny that comes from being married to the most powerful military commander in the nation. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. And you repaid her by dancing with your mistress in front of the entire city's elite, in front of everyone who has spent years looking for an excuse to destroy her because of my mistakes. It's not what it looks like, Dominic said quietly. Then what is it? A trap, for a murderer and a traitor. Lord Hartwell studied him for a long moment, his diplomatic instincts clearly warring with his paternal fury. Finally he said, "She's in the library." And Blackwell, this had better be the best explanation you've ever given in your life, or I will personally ensure your career ends tomorrow morning. Dominic nodded. I understand. The library was at the back of the house, a modest room lined with books that represented decades of a diplomat's career. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to the door, still wearing the midnight blue gown from the ball. She did not turn when he entered. Evelyn, you have 30 seconds to explain, she said, her voice dangerously calm. Why I should not file for legal separation tomorrow morning. Dominic closed the door behind him, then crossed to the desk and set down the leather portfolio. Because I was hunting a murderer, he said quietly, and I needed you to hate me to do it. That made her turn. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, her face pale and composed. She looked at the portfolio, then at him, her expression unreadable. Explain. So he did. He told her everything, about Harrison Carlyle's death and the investigation that had been too convenient, too quick to rule it an accident, about Thornwell's appropriations bill and the companies he secretly controlled. About the 18 months Dominic had spent building a case, gathering evidence, trying to find proof that would hold up in court. He told her about Vivian's role, not as a mistress, but as a widow sitting on documents that could destroy her husband's killers. About the strategy of making himself look compromised, distracted, vulnerable. About letting Whitmore and Thornwell believe they had neutralized him by exploiting his supposed weakness for a beautiful woman. And he told her about the choice he had made, to let her believe the worst, to use her genuine reaction as proof of his supposed betrayal, because anything less than complete authenticity would have tipped off Vivian that it was a trap. When he finished, Evelyn was silent for a long moment. Then she walked to the desk, opened the portfolio, and began to read. Dominic watched her face as she went through the documents, watched her eyes widen at the financial statements, narrow at the coded correspondence, harden at Harrison's confession. It took her 20 minutes to read everything. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You let me walk out of that ballroom thinking you had betrayed me. Yes, you let 300 people watch me be humiliated. Yes, you let me spend an entire night believing that my marriage, 13 years of my life, was a lie. Yes. She closed the portfolio with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. You are a brilliant strategist, Dominic Blackwell. Her voice shook slightly, and an absolute fool. Dominic said nothing. There was nothing to say. I had to keep you safe, he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. If Thornwell or Whitmore suspected you knew anything about the investigation, I am not fragile, Evelyn cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. I am not some porcelain doll you need to protect from the truth. I'm your wife, your partner. And you treated me like a pawn in one of your military campaigns. I treated you, Dominic said, his control finally cracking. Like the most important piece on the board, the one I could not afford to lose. The room fell silent. Evelyn stared at him, her expression shifting from fury to something more complex. What? Dominic exhaled slowly, the words he had never said in 13 years of marriage suddenly forcing their way out. 13 years ago, I married you because it was strategic. You needed protection from society's judgment. I needed a wife who could navigate political circles, someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated and dismissed. He took a step toward her, but somewhere in those 13 years, you stopped being strategy. You became the reason I come home instead of sleeping in my office. The reason I actually care about political dinners and social obligations, because they give me an excuse to spend time in the same room as you. The one person in this entire damned city whose opinion of me actually matters." His voice dropped. "And the thought of you being hurt because of my work, because of choices I made, because of enemies I made, was unacceptable. I would rather have you hate me and be safe than love me and be in danger." Evelyn's breath caught, her composure finally cracking. "So you hurt me instead?" "Yes," she laughed, a short, bitter sound that had no humor in it. "You are an idiot. I know. I could have helped you. If you had just told me, I could have played my part. I know. I could have pretended to be hurt, pretended to believe the worst, given you the same authenticity you needed. I know." Evelyn closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, 2 tears slipped down her cheeks. "If you ever make a decision about my safety, about my life, about our marriage without consulting me first," she said quietly, "I will leave you, do you understand?" Dominic nodded, something in his chest loosening for the first time since she had walked out of that ballroom. "I understand." "Good." She picked up the portfolio, holding it between them like evidence. "Now, what's your plan for destroying Thornwell?" And despite everything, the hurt and the fury and the night of hell they had both just endured, Dominic felt something that might have been hope. "I have a strategy," he said, "but I'll need your help." Evelyn's smile was sharp and dangerous and absolutely beautiful. "Then let's go to war, General." The emergency session of the Senate was called 3 days later, convened with unusual speed by a coalition of senators who had received anonymous packages containing just enough evidence to demand immediate action. Ambassador Richard Thornwell attended with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won every game that mattered. He wore his finest suit, his medals polished, his silver hair groomed to perfection. He took his seat in the visitors' gallery with the casual arrogance of someone who had spent 20 years manipulating the system to his advantage. Colonel James Whitmore stood at the back of the chamber, equally assured, his uniform pressed to parade ground standards. He exchanged satisfied glances with Thornwell, both men secure in their victory. After all, General Blackwell was compromised. His wife had left him. The entire city had witnessed the scandal at the Winter Ball. His reputation was in tatters. Whatever investigation he might have been conducting was surely dead in the water now. Then the massive oak doors at the front of the Senate chamber swung open, and General Dominic Blackwell walked in. The chamber went silent, every conversation stopping mid-sentence. But it wasn't Dominic who made Thornwell's confident expression falter. It was the woman walking beside him, her hand resting on his arm with unmistakable intimacy. Lady Evelyn Blackwell. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that made her look like royalty, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that somehow managed to be both elegant and severe. Around her throat, the sapphire necklace caught the light from the chamber's high windows with cold fire. Her chin was high, her expression was serene. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. Together they looked unstoppable. Thornwell's face went pale. Whitmore straightened from his casual lean against the wall, his confident smirk evaporating. Dominic approached the speaker's podium with Evelyn at his side. When they reached the front of the chamber, he handed her a chair, not dismissing her to the gallery, but positioning her beside him as an equal. She sat with fluid grace, her eyes scanning the assembled senators with the same sharp intelligence her father had once been famous for. Dominic placed the leather portfolio on the speaker's desk, then turned to address the chamber. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying with perfect military precision, "I come before you today to present evidence of conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States." The chamber erupted in shocked conversation. The Speaker of the Senate banged his gavel. "General Blackwell, this is highly irregular. 18 months ago," Dominic continued, his voice cutting through the noise without rising in volume, "Senator Harrison Carlisle was murdered on the direct orders of Ambassador Richard Thornwell with the assistance of Colonel James Whitmore in order to secure passage of the military appropriations bill that would have enriched Thornwell's secretly held companies by millions of dollars." Thornwell shot to his feet, his face flushed with outrage. "This is absurd. You have no proof. This is clearly a desperate attempt by a man whose own scandal has—" "I have Senator Carlisle's personal records," Dominic said calmly. Opening the portfolio. I have financial statements showing payments from shell companies controlled by Ambassador Thornwell to Colonel Whitmore. I have coded correspondence detailing the plot, and most significantly, I have a signed confession written by Senator Carlyle before his death, which he entrusted to his wife. He pulled out the documents one by one, laying them on the desk with deliberate precision. I also have 18 months of surveillance documentation, witness testimony from sources within Thornwell's organization, and forensic evidence that the so-called hunting accident was, in fact, a professionally executed assassination. Whitmore tried to leave. 2 military officers, men Dominic had positioned by the doors before the session began, blocked his exit with crossed rifles. "You set us up," Thornwell hissed, his composure finally cracking. That whole performance with Mrs. Carlyle, the affair, it was all a lie. "Yes," Dominic said simply. "It was." He looked directly at Thornwell, his steel-grey eyes cold as winter. "You and Whitmore believed I was compromised, distracted by an affair, vulnerable to blackmail. You believed that because I allowed you to believe it. I let you think you had won." Evelyn rose from her chair, her voice carrying across the chamber with perfect clarity. "While you were celebrating what you thought was the general's downfall," she said, "I was working with my father to verify every piece of evidence, to interview witnesses, to build a case that would be absolutely unassailable in court." She walked to the speaker's desk, pulling out another set of documents. "These are depositions from 3 of your employees, Ambassador Thornwell, men who were present when you ordered Senator Carlyle's assassination, men who were willing to testify in exchange for immunity." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "You underestimated me because I'm a woman, because I'm the daughter of a disgraced diplomat, because you thought a scandal would destroy me." She looked at him with absolute contempt. "You were wrong." The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses credible. The conspiracy so thoroughly documented that even Thornwell's expensive lawyers couldn't find a way through it. Thornwell was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, corruption, and treason. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Whitmore was stripped of his military rank, dishonorably discharged, and court-martialed for murder, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His sentence matched Thornwell's. Mrs. Vivienne Carlyle testified as a key witness, her composure and dignity throughout the proceedings earning her a grudging respect from society that no amount of beauty or wealth could have purchased. When it was over, when Thornwell and Whitmore were led away in chains, Vivienne quietly left the city for her family's estate in Virginia, where she would rebuild her life away from the scandal and the memories. And through it all, through 3 weeks of testimony and cross-examination, through endless newspaper coverage and society's insatiable appetite for every detail, Evelyn stood beside Dominic, not behind him, not as decoration, as an equal. She testified about the letters Whitmore had sent her, her clear recollection and composed delivery, making the jury lean forward to catch every word. She presented evidence her father had helped gather, explaining the diplomatic connections that had enabled them to track down witnesses across 3 states. She faced down the society matrons who had whispered about her, with a grace that made them look petty and small by comparison. And when senators and generals and industrialists approached Dominic with questions or concerns, they increasingly found themselves addressing both General and Lady Blackwell, because it became clear very quickly that she was as much a part of the investigation as he was. The day the verdict was announced, Dominic and Evelyn walked out of the courthouse together into a sea of reporters and curious onlookers. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton was among the crowd gathered outside, her purple silk dress impossible to miss. She stepped forward as they descended the courthouse steps, her expression humble in a way Evelyn had never seen. "Lady Blackwell," she said, her voice carrying to the surrounding crowd, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn stopped, Dominic's hand at the small of her back. "Yes," she said calmly. "You do." Mrs. Pemberton flushed but pressed on. "I should not have assumed, should not have spread gossip, should not have condemned you based on appearances rather than—" "You should not have assumed anything," Evelyn agreed, her voice clear and firm. "But you did. As did most of this city, you believed scandal over character. You chose entertaining gossip over difficult truth. She looked past Mrs. Pemberton to the assembled crowd, reporters with their notebooks, society women with their knowing looks, men who had watched her be humiliated and done nothing. "Let that be your lesson," she said. "Not everything is as it appears. Not every scandal is what it seems, and not every woman who stands quiet is weak." Then she took Dominic's arm, and they walked away, leaving Mrs. Pemberton and the rest of society to contemplate their own assumptions. 6 months after the trial, Evelyn hosted her bi-weekly salon at the Blackwell residence. What had started as a modest gathering of a dozen people had grown into one of the city's most sought-after invitations. Senators and generals mixed with artists and academics, politicians' wives engaged in serious policy discussions with military strategists. The conversations ranged from agricultural reform to military strategy to the latest developments in engineering. It was radical. It was also wildly successful. The salon had become a place where real work got done, where alliances were forged, where ideas that would later become legislation were first tested and refined. Dominic stood at the edge of the main parlor, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching Evelyn debate the merits of expanded railway regulation with 2 senators and a general's wife. She was in her element, brilliant, incisive, unafraid to challenge assumptions or push back against weak arguments. Her eyes sparkled when she was engaged like this, her hands moving as she made her points, her entire bearing radiating the kind of confidence that came from knowing her own mind. She had always been these things, Dominic realized. He had just been too focused on protecting her to see it, too concerned with keeping her safe to recognize that she didn't need protection. She needed partnership. "You're staring, Blackwell." Dominic turned to find Lord Edmund Hartwell at his elbow, the old man's eyes bright with amusement. "I'm aware," Dominic said. Lord Hartwell chuckled, sipping his own drink. "You know, when you first asked for her hand 13 years ago, I wasn't sure you deserved her." "I didn't." "No," the old man agreed cheerfully. "You didn't. Cold as ice, strategic to a fault, couldn't see past the tactical advantages of the match." He paused. "But you learned, eventually." Across the room, Evelyn glanced up, caught Dominic's eye and smiled. It was a small smile. Private. Meant only for him. But it hit him with the same force it always did now, like a blow to the chest, like falling, like coming home all at once. "I nearly lost her," Dominic said quietly. "But you didn't." Lord Hartwell's voice softened. "You made a mistake, a significant one. But you acknowledged it, you fixed it, and most importantly, you changed. That's all any of us can do." He clapped Dominic on the shoulder. "Though I'd suggest not making any more strategic decisions that involve publicly humiliating my daughter. My heart can't take it." Dominic smiled despite himself. "Noted." Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the servants had cleared the parlor, Dominic found Evelyn in their bedroom, unpinning her hair at her vanity. Their bedroom. Singular. That had changed 2 months after the trial, when Evelyn had simply moved her things from her separate room into his without discussion or ceremony. Dominic still remembered coming home to find her dresses in his wardrobe, her books on his nightstand, her presence transforming the space from a place he slept into something that felt like home. "Successful evening," he said now, leaning against the doorframe. "Very." She met his eyes in the mirror, her fingers working through her elaborate hairstyle. "Senator Whitfield is reconsidering his position on the education bill. Senator Morrison wants to discuss your military reform proposals. And Mrs. Harrison has some fascinating ideas about public health initiatives that I think you should hear." "Because of you," Dominic said. "Because of us," Evelyn corrected, pulling the last pin from her hair and letting it fall in dark waves over her shoulders. "You provided the military and political context. I provided the social and practical perspectives. We make a better team than either of us does alone." She turned to face him, setting down her hairpins. "That's what partnership means, Dominic. Not protection, not strategy, partnership." He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to object if she wanted. She didn't. When he reached her, he knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. "Evelyn." Yes? I love you. He had said it before, 2 months ago, in a whispered confession in the dark in the aftermath of making love for the first time in their 13-year marriage. But he had never said it like this, in full light, sober, with absolute clarity. I love you, he said again, his voice steady. I have for years. I was just too much of a coward to admit it, too convinced that emotion was weakness, that control was everything, that strategy mattered more than... He paused. More than you. Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks, but she was smiling. You're still an idiot sometimes, she whispered. I know, but you're my idiot. She cupped his face in her hands. And I love you too, even when you make catastrophically stupid strategic decisions that nearly destroy everything. He kissed her then, soft and slow and full of everything he had spent 13 years not saying. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn rested her forehead against his. Promise me something, she said quietly. Anything. No more secrets, no more protecting me from your work. We face things together, or we don't face them at all. Dominic pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. I promise, and he meant it. 2 years later, Evelyn stood in the same ballroom where her world had nearly shattered. Watching couples swirl across the floor in elaborate gowns and formal uniforms, the winter ball had become their tradition, a yearly reminder that they had survived scandal, conspiracy, their own mistakes, and emerged stronger on the other side. Dominic approached her through the crowd, his military uniform as immaculate as always, his expression softening when he saw her. He extended his hand, palm up. May I have this dance, Lady Blackwell? She smiled, placing her hand in his. You may, General. They moved onto the floor, and the crowd parted for them automatically, not out of shock or scandal, but out of respect. The whispers that followed them now were different. Look at them, still completely devoted after 15 years. I heard she's advising 3 separate Senate committees now, and he refuses to make any major military decisions without consulting her first. A true partnership, the kind of marriage the rest of us should aspire to. Evelyn rested her head against Dominic's shoulder as they moved through the waltz, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They're talking about us again, she murmured. Let them. Does it bother you, the gossip, the attention? Not even slightly. His hand tightened at her waist, protective but gentle. Not when the truth is so much better than anything they could imagine. She laughed softly, the sound lost in the music. The waltz swelled around them, violins and cellos weaving together in perfect harmony. I meant what I said that night, Dominic said quietly, his lips close to her ear. 2 years ago, you are the most important thing in my life, the reason for everything that matters. I know, Evelyn replied, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. And you are mine. They danced until the music ended, until the last note faded into applause. And when it did, they walked off that ballroom floor together, neither ahead nor behind but side by side. Equal, unshakable, partners, home. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the city in white. Inside, General Dominic Blackwell and Lady Evelyn Blackwell stood together at the edge of the ballroom, watching the next dance begin. And for the first time in either of their lives, they were exactly where they belonged, together,